Welcome to the 2020 Presidential Race Review. I'm your host, Jessica Kwong. We're now just weeks away from the November election, and things are heating up between President Donald Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming two guests who are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. I have Robert Hornak. He's a Republican consultant, and he's the former executive director of the Queens Republican Party. And I also have Jesse Minc. He's a personal injury lawyer in New York City, and he has a degree in political science. Thank you both so much for joining me today via Zoom.
Thank you.
In the pandemic, I can't be in the studio. How are you both doing today?
Doing well.
Very well.
Great.
Forward to our discussion.
Right. Well, let's get right to it. I'm going to ask straight up, who are you going to support in the November election? Let's start with you, Jesse.
I am supporting Joe Biden. I'm doing so because I believe he has a track record of, solid experience in government. He's been in the government, federal government, for 40 years, as long as I've been alive. And I think that he is somebody who has been a consensus builder and a deal maker. And I think that ultimately what is needed in this country now is to return to a sense of stability in the federal government. And I think Joe Biden, along with the cabinet and the regulatory staff that he will install when he is president, will be beneficial to the country, which I think is on the brink of structural instability at this point. And I think Mr. Biden would be an excellent contrast to the current administration in that respect.
Jesse, are you a Democrat or independent? It sounds like you're not a Republican, but I want to be clear.
No, I'm a registered Democrat. I would be a middle of the road Democrat. That's where I would put myself.
Okay, sounds like you're in line with Biden then. And Robert, who are you going to vote for in the 2020 election?
Oh, I think it's no mystery that I'll be supporting Donald Trump. I think he's done an excellent job in the last 4 years of moving this country forward, solving or addressing a lot of the problems that we've had. And we never thought we'd see some of these incredible successes that we've seen that Donald Trump has brought about with his booming economy, with job growth across all sectors and all communities, exploding stock market reaching all-time highs that nobody ever thought we'd see, on the verge of peace in the Middle East, negotiating with North Korea, taming Iran. I mean, whether you look nationally or internationally, I think overall he's doing a fantastic job. Okay.
Now I wanted to ask, who do you think is actually going to win the election? So before the coronavirus, I thought Donald Trump had a pretty good shot. The economy was great. And then now with the virus, it's totally different. So who do you think is actually going to win? I know who you want to win, but the reality is a different story. So what are your thoughts on this?
You want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
No. Jesse, you want to go? Be my guest.
Go ahead.
All right, go ahead, Robert.
Okay. I strongly believe that Donald Trump is going to win. I did believe so, like you thought early on. I mean, everything in this country was going phenomenally well. When coronavirus hit, unfortunately, it did sidetrack us. There's no question about that. We have had a very, very rough year. I think he has done as well as anybody could have expected anybody to do in dealing with it. We're trying to reopen the country as quickly as possible. Some states are going much faster than others, but it's going to be a process. I think Trump has done a very good job of addressing it. I won't say perfectly, but I think fairly well, and as well as anybody could have expected anybody to do, considering all of the unknowns and all of the variables and where we started in this whole thing. So I still think that people look at him as the guy that's going to help us recover the fastest, get us back on track to where we left off at the beginning of the year, which people were overwhelmingly happy with.
Well, that sounds like something a Trump supporter would say. Jesse, do you do that by any chance or not at all?
Well, I think Mr. Trump's response to the coronavirus, especially as recently revealed in Bob Woodward's book, was bungled and misleading in a lot of ways. But I don't ultimately believe that the Democrats will be able to stop Mr. Trump as much as I might like that to be the case. I think that looking at the states that ultimately are going to decide this election, given the Electoral College reality, and in my eye, especially in Michigan and Wisconsin, I think Mr. Trump has an advantage. I think that, albeit that Mr. Biden's been up in the polls consistently by a significant margin. Everybody predicted Hillary Clinton to win by a landslide last time, and look at what happened. And it was in large part due to what happened in specifically Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And I think that the coronavirus, whereas people who are concerned with good government might be thinking that it is hands down an issue that's going to favor Mr. Biden by being a negative for Mr. Trump, I think that the governor's lockdowns in certain states have drawn a lot of ire of a lot of citizens. I think also that even though the economy in a lot of ways is cratered because of the coronavirus, people still trust Mr. Trump more with the economy than they do trust the Democrats. And these are not realities that I'm happy about, but they are realities. And I think that if you're asking me who's going to win, I would put my money on Mr. Trump, albeit hopeful that I would lose that bet.
Wow, Jesse, so you actually think that even though you're supporting Joe Biden, you think that Trump's going to win the election? Is that what you're saying?
I unfortunately think it's more likely he wins because of the Electoral College. Look, if it was a popular vote, straight up popular vote nationwide, Mr. Biden would win handily, if you ask me, and I think that's pretty clear. But I know that's not our system. It's not our system for a reason. At different times in history, it favors different parties. And right now, I think it's unfortunately favoring the Republicans. I'll be out to vote on November 3rd. Being a New Yorker, some might say my vote doesn't matter. I certainly don't see it that way. But I think that really we got to be watching the key swing states. And I think that certain political movements going on favor Trump, whether or not the pollsters pick that up in their polls.
Right, that's totally true what you're saying. We're thinking back to 2016 when most people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and it seemed a complete surprise that Trump won. But Robert, you've been, I would say, maybe a lifelong Republican, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that. And were you surprised that Trump won in 2016, or was it what you were expecting?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because I was thinking along the same lines. In 2016, I think what we saw, and by the way, I started out as a Marco Rubio supporter. So I was a little bit late to the Trump bandwagon, but once it became clear, and I'm a New Yorker, I knew Mr. Trump, I've met him in the past. I've had political conversations with him. I find him to be a very intelligent guy and very, very well informed, by the way. But what we saw in 2016 was Trump, when it became obvious he was going to be the nominee, and as he became the nominee, the Republican Party coalesced behind him, but there was still a great deal of tentativeness there. They were not sure what to expect. They were not sure, we were not sure, just how conservative, how consistent he was going to be, being that he had actually been a registered Democrat earlier in his life. So we didn't know specifically issue by issue how it was going to work out. I think Republicans over the last 4 years have become incredibly pleased with what he's delivered to us in terms of policy, and the fervor to support Trump now from his base, I think is as animated and as high as you could possibly expect. It's much more intense than it was 4 years ago, and I think that is going to benefit him tremendously come the election. I can't say the same thing, sorry, Jesse, on the flip side. I don't think Biden supporters, I think while they dislike Trump as much as they did 4 years ago, I don't think it's really increased because it was pretty highly there 4 years ago that there was this incredible dislike for Trump on the left. I may have gotten more intense with some of those people, but overall I think it's pretty much at about the same level. But there was no enthusiasm really for Joe Biden. He's been around for 47 years. He has scant, if any, accomplishments to tout other than being present. People are just not thrilled with him. I mean, he was the compromise candidate coming out of the primary. There was no question about that. Whether they wanted Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or somebody else, he was the least objectionable, so he got the nomination. And incidentally, he was also the guy that they figured would do the least harm down ballot were he to lose. So what we are also seeing now is coronavirus. And that is a huge variable that even with all my years in politics, I don't know how to factor it into the turnout for this year's election. If it wasn't for coronavirus, like we said earlier, I think Trump would win overwhelmingly. But with coronavirus and the mail-in ballots and people's fear to engage and to vote, we don't know what's going to happen. Is one side going to be more affected by it and maybe drop off and pass more than the other side? If so, I would probably predict that would be the Democratic side, because when you combine the fear of engaging in the process due to the coronavirus and the lack of enthusiasm for the nominee, that could hurt Democratic turnout, but you never know. It could hurt Republican turnout because the Republican base tends to skew older. So at the end of the day, we really just don't know. We're sailing into uncharted waters here.
Jesse, do you feel that what Robert just mentioned, that Joe Biden was the most agreeable candidate, are you happy that he was the nominee, or that was, now you're supporting him just because you think he's not as bad as Trump? And, one of the things I want to bring up is that Joe Biden's had a lot of gaffes, and then Trump's attacking him, saying that he's not mentally capable of being president. I mean, he just had another one the other day. I think he got the number of people who died from coronavirus way off in the millions. So,
well, much like Mr. Trump has an attenuated relationship with the truth, Mr. Biden is known for being gaffe prone. And I think that that's baked into the cake with him, as, what lying is with Mr. Trump, and his inability to be truthful, and his ability to, waffle between answers and conclusions in the same sentence. I don't think, Biden, ultimately people know what they're getting with him. And I think really, from my perspective, what matters with Biden is his knowledge of how the federal government works, his relationships with people who I think ultimately would do the work, in terms of being cabinet secretaries, in terms of heads of administrative agencies, in restoring the functioning of, the apparatus of the United States government. And for me personally, what a lot of what seems to play in the media doesn't particularly matter to me. Maybe I'm overeducated about it, but I really am concerned more with getting the government back towards functioning well, especially domestically.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more 2020 presidential race review.
There's a way to stop the spread of coronavirus. There's a way to protect others. There's a way to keep your family safe. New York figured it out. The answer weighs less than an ounce. It's not a heavy lift. Be New York tough. Mask up, America.
Welcome back to the 2020 Presidential Race Review. I'm your host, Jessica Kwong. I still have with me two guests. Robert Hornak, he's a Republican strategist, and he's the former executive director of the Queens Republican Party, and also Jesse Minc. He's a New York City-based personal injury lawyer and also has a degree in political science. Thank you both again so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So let's continue on and talk about the Postal Service. So there are so many variables that have gone into this election. First of all, the coronavirus, and now we have the Postal Service controversy. Donald Trump has said he's got like this campaign against mail-in voting, and there's all these theories that he basically wants to suppress maybe people from voting who are Democratic, because Democrats tend to vote more by mail. What do you think about all this? Why don't we start with you, Jesse?
Well, the chief of the post office, Mr. DeJoy, gave some testimony a couple of weeks back, if I recall, and I don't think it was very satisfactory as to what the reason, the justification for the obvious slowdown in mail. I can tell you this from my business. We are a law firm. Much of what we do has to be done through the mail. The mail has been noticeably slower this summer. And, while I'm not privy to the nitty gritty of a lot of this, I can tell you as a citizen, I certainly noticed the mail being much slower, letters taking a week or two to get to us, especially in New York City. And I think that, allowing vote by mail now, especially in this time, is an important thing if it can be done securely. I think that, the state governments have taken steps to make sure that can be done. And I think that it's something that should be promoted, especially now, because I think that participation in an engaged citizenry is necessary. And if people believe that they cannot participate in the political process by voting, which is the way that most people participate if they participate at all, I think that it can demoralize the citizenry and it can be negative for the quality of the democracy going forward. And I think an engaged citizenry is promoted by vote by mail. As long as it can be done securely, I think it should be promoted.
Okay. Robert, what do you think of these almost conspiracy theories, right? Or we can call them conspiracy theories that, mail-in voting, people could vote it twice. I mean, people are saying, Trump was almost saying, vote by mail and then go to the polls and check and make sure that your vote has been counted. And if it hasn't been counted, you should vote again. But then that sort of drew some thoughts that he was encouraging voting twice. What are your thoughts on all this postal service stuff?
I agree that a lot of this is conspiracy theory, but there's two different scenarios here, two different factors here. There are two different kinds of mail-in voting is maybe the better way to say it. There's the traditional kind, which anybody can still do, which is you contact your Board of Elections, you fill out a form, you request an absentee ballot, they will mail you the ballot when the ballots are printed, you fill it out at home, put it in a secure envelope, and you mail it back. You've requested the ballot, so we know that you're at least a live, breathing individual person, and that there's some paper trail there to say that this person requested a ballot. Now, there's the other type that they're actually trying to advocate for this year for the first time in every state but one, which has been doing it for a while now. And that is where they send out what they call a generic ballot. And what they do is they take the voter rolls, every person that's registered to vote, and they just blanket mail them a ballot, regardless of whether they've actually requested one or not, whether they intend to go and vote on election day at the poll sites or not. And we know historically from turnout figures, and this is a provable fact, about 65% of the electorate of the people registered to vote will actually go and vote. It's not 100%. It's about 65%, which is 2/3 of the registered electorate, which means you're going to have 1/3 of the ballots. We had 110 million people vote last time. Imagine 30 million ballots floating around out there if we did this across the country with no way to track them, no way to know what's going to happen to them, having not been requested in the first place. And that system is going to be ripe for abuse and fraud. Now, what Jesse said earlier, I agree with part of what he said, which is that, yes, the mail system has slowed over the summer. The main cause of that is because coronavirus has actually increased the absentee rate at the post office. Postal workers are like everybody else. They get sick. And when they get sick, they do the right thing and they stay home to not infect their fellow employees. So everybody's noticed that the mail's taking a little bit longer. So that's why it's even doubly crazy to try to overwhelm a system that's shorthanded right now because of personnel issues, to try to swamp them with millions and millions of extra ballots. Now, could they handle it? I have no doubt that they probably could, but when you consider all the factors that make this very unsafe of a way to approach it, I think it's crazy. I think Trump is doing the right thing by talking about it and exposing it for the risk that it is.
Well, do you think that the fact that there's going to be so much more mail-in voting and absentee ballots, do you think that's going to have an effect on the election, or that it's not going to have an outcome on whether Trump wins or if Biden wins? Because Trump is under the belief that that it's going to hurt him.
Well, I do believe that the more people that vote, the better the Democrats do. That's something that the Republicans nationwide have recognized, and you see their efforts in states across the country to knock people off voter rolls and what some might call suppress votes. They were never fans of certain elements of the Voting Rights Act, and I think that going back a decade at least. Turnout operations have really determined a lot of the way elections go. And it is conventional wisdom that the more people turn out, the better the Democrats do. And I think that mail-in voting is viewed as a threat by Donald Trump to his reelection prospects. I think also, just to touch on something, I recalled a bit of data that I had been made aware of, that apparently the Postal Service over time was restricted, and something having to do with if mail didn't get delivered or put out for delivery by the end of a shift, it was to be left, and then it would sit a week in a post office before it actually got delivered. Some commentators have said that was a deliberate way to make the mail look unreliable, while this whole mail-in voting thing was hot off the political presses. And I think that, ultimately the Republicans tend to do better when turnout is lower. And so that might be motivating a lot of why they don't like the idea of mail-in balloting.
Well, I would actually disagree with that, because the highest turnout rates of any election cycle will be on a presidential election. At roughly 65% is as high as it ever gets. It's much lower when you just have a gubernatorial or a municipal election on the ballot. Republicans in 2016 won the vast majority of states. That high turnout that we had actually benefited Donald Trump very well, because he won over 300 electoral votes. So it was a pretty solid victory from that perspective. In terms of the reliability of the post office, I don't think anybody's trying to intentionally undermine the reliability of the post office. Look, we all rely on the post office. We all want it to function at its best. They've had some issues in recent years. Postal delivery is actually way down from where it was a decade ago because of email and other electronic means. So they have been downsizing. They have been making changes. Many of these changes have been in the planning stages going back to the Obama administration. So none of this is new. These are discussions that have been ongoing for quite a number of years in terms of how to make it more efficient and how to make it lose less money. But we all want the post office to be its best.
Well, let's move on to another issue that is at the center of the election is Black Lives Matter, racial equality. So what do you think about Donald Trump's rhetoric going into this election? He's saying that he's maintaining law and order, that he's protecting the country from unrest. And overall, how do you think that he's dealt with the George Floyd's death, and in general? Is he needs the Black vote, right? I mean, any vote is going to help him, but do you think he's done a good job of that, or is he isolating or basically not getting the voters that he could get because of the way he's responded? Robert, what do you think about that?
Well, I think he's actually acquitted himself fairly well through this process in terms of reaching out, showing compassion, saying a lot of the right things. Look, nobody wants to see violence spread across the country, but the fact of the matter is that it has been spreading because of a small group of agitators on the far left that want to create dissent and disturbance in this country, that want to undermine our democratic institutions. And they have developed a strong foothold inside the Democratic Party, which I find particularly scary, because I do like to work in a bipartisan way as much as possible. But I think, look, the government's first responsibility is to keep its citizens safe. And if you can't have some basic law and order, nobody's disputing that what happened to George Floyd was a travesty. I mean, Donald Trump admitted so, and every Republican has said so. That should never happen. For a police officer to put his knee or restrict the breathing of somebody, of the suspect under any circumstances is wrong. And what we want to do is invest in greater police training while maintaining law and order. Look, if you look at the reforms that occurred throughout the 1990s, which started here in New York City under Rudy Giuliani and spread to many cities across the country, no people benefited more from the increased safety on the streets than Black and brown communities. So we want to maintain that level of safety and security and improved quality of life in those neighborhoods.
Jesse, what do you think about how Trump has been handling Black Lives Matter and his rhetoric? Is he isolating voters he could get, or he's going to win like you may have predicted?
I think that almost every one of the people that are in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement, however fervent their belief and to whatever degree they take it, are not voting for Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump's base is inherently suspicious of Black Lives Matter, in large part because of the mission statement of the group, which espoused what could objectively be deemed, borderline Marxist ideals, which really scare a lot of people. And, even moderate Democrats like myself are given pause by that. I personally have to separate the protesters from the group Black Lives Matter. I think the people out protesting are doing, the right thing. I agree with Robert 100% that police brutality is a travesty. It is a pandemic of its own across this country, and it's been happening for a very long time. We're only now just seeing it as ubiquitously as we are because of the ubiquitousness of cell phone cameras. Everything is captured on video. It was happening before the cell phone was invented, but it just wasn't in everybody's face, and especially white America wasn't as aware, and now they are. We are. And we're outraged and upset and sorry about it all, but that sentiment is much different than the group Black Lives Matter, which unfortunately, as Robert says, in its own words, is a revolutionary group that espouses a lot of things that middle-of-the-road Democrats like myself have a lot of problems with.
Well, ultimately, Jesse, what we'd like to do is actually separate, just like you said, exactly like you said. We want to separate the movement, the large movement, which we agree with, from the small group of radicals that are trying to hijack this movement.
Well, the Black Lives Matter movement, actually, they recently removed the part about disturbing the nuclear family. So they've actually taken that down from their site very recently. But anyway, that's all the time we have to talk. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. And thank you for tuning in to the 2020 Presidential Race Review. We'll find out very soon who's going to be president, and hopefully we'll be able to analyze that very soon. Thanks again.